My name is Jonah Dempsey. Today I'd like to talk about the myth of progress. Progress is a trend in modern society insofar as it's almost an obsession. Am I making progress? If I'm not getting better, I must be getting worse. The capitalist ethos, if your business isn't growing, then it must be diminishing. The idea is that progress is something that's always desirable, and that it's something that we can recognize, that we can even say there's almost a normative sort of way of progressing. For instance, growing up, getting a good job, and so on. And of course, this is highly problematic because such normativity hides the privilege or, the conditions which construct it. It's basically the idea when we talk about progress, we have to be careful because otherwise we end up perpetuating these sort of societal norms. We think, oh, you've made progress from being a child to an adult if you've gotten a regular job and had your standard heterosexual, Oedipal family life and all of these things. And or we might say that somebody has made spiritual progress when that person, finds God or whatever. But it's problematic because all these notions of progress rely on normativity. So it seems like in our society we have this obsession with progress, but what it really is almost an obsession with conformity or with standardization. So a lot of times people talk about progress, but what they really mean is normalcy. For instance, if you go to certain kinds of therapy, Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, was highly critical of ego psychology and a lot of the therapies practiced in the UK and the US, because if you go to these certain kinds of therapies, they're all based around this notion of progress. And the idea is, before you come into therapy or upon your arrival, you are in a sorry state where your ego is, disordered, and you learn how, based on the healthy ego of the therapist, who acts as kind of a model, you identify the therapist's healthy ego as your ego ideal, and you kind of form your ego over it. And what ends up happening is that you eventually feel as though you've made progress, precisely defined as progressing to a place where your ego has been modeled on that of the therapist. So for Jacques Lacan, this was highly problematic because, for him, the aim of psychoanalysis, which is, I guess, quite different than therapy in the ego psychology sense, for Lacan's psychoanalysis, the goal was not to strengthen the ego because the ego is the seat of resistance, but instead or I shouldn't even say goal, because goal already kind of, you can imagine actually getting there. So I'll say aim. The aim of Lacan's psychoanalysis is already not to strengthen the ego or to have a healthier ego. It's almost the healthier the ego, the more unhealthy the subject or the self. So basically, when we talk about progress, we have to be really careful because a lot of times we end up perpetuating this sort of normativity or this kind of idea of a standard which you have to model yourself after. So it seems like progress is very difficult to even really talk about, but there is something like progress. There is individuation, there is maturation. People grow up, they grow older. As we age, we develop in various ways. But it's not always linear. I mean, maybe it's the idea of kind of a linear progress, a progress that starts here and just quantitatively goes, on a curve. Maybe that's the problem, because the linear progress would be a progress that doesn't allow for mistakes. It doesn't allow, in some sense, even a mistake is progress. So even regression can be progress if one recognizes it as such. So there's a weird meta level where we shouldn't define progress through some kind of a normative quantitative yardstick, but we should define it in how one responds to things, whether those things are interpreted as progressive or regressive. So in other words, even a mistake is an opportunity for progress, learning from your mistakes, or even a regressive episode. Say I have a compulsion, or I have something. I want to have progress. Progress to me is being free of the symptom, but what I should keep in mind is if I regress and I have that symptom again, it can also be progress, because the symptom itself can be telling me something, where if I completely eliminate the symptom, my idea of progress is being free from mistakes, free from symptoms, free from compulsions. But if I give into those compulsions, or if I have those symptoms, if I make those mistakes, that can very well be an opportunity for growth, for progress, and that's not just an opportunity to double down on my good intentions. What's interesting is every time I'm encountered with something that stifles my progress, an obstacle, a hindrance, if we want to call it that, I'm not even saying here that it really is an obstacle to my progress, because we can put progress in scare quotes. What I'm saying is, when I encounter something that I perceive as an obstacle of my progress, something which hinders me, which frustrates me, when I experience privation, like I want to have something and I can't have it, basically what that does is that it gives me an opportunity. It's an encounter where I can adapt. It's basically an opportunity to adapt. So there's almost different definitions of progress. I mean, if I imagine progress as not ever having any antagonism, or not ever having anything that frustrates me or any privation, then I'm going to not experience it as progress. But there's a different kind of progress, maybe a meta progress, which is learning to accept the lack of progress. Like, to give an example, say I want to get rid of all the clutter in my apartment, and I feel like I'm making progress towards getting rid of it. But is it true progress to get rid of the clutter, or is it progress on a meta level, on some kind of psychological level, as opposed to just instead of using the yardstick, how much clutter do I have, some kind of quantitative measurement, isn't there another level of progress where I cease to care about it, or I learn to bear frustration? So in other words, there's a naive idea of progress, which is overcoming frustration, but then there's a different kind of progress, which is bearing frustration. It's being able to withstand it and being able to abstain from one's compulsive evacuations of frustration. So it's, it gets into the idea here, what kind of progress, if I say that I want to make progress, what do I mean? If I go to a therapist and say I want to make progress, I probably mean I want to be free from my symptoms. But what if real progress is learning to bear my symptoms? Or even, instead of trying to heal my symptoms, trying to allow my symptoms to heal me? Because as Carl Jung said, we don't cure our symptoms, they cure us. We don't cure our illnesses cure us. So as long as we're trying to eliminate symptoms, we're kind of perpetuating this normative, quantitative idea of progress. Oh, I'm going to have progress towards this idealized image of a person that doesn't have any problems, a problem-free person. It's almost like that's the negative myth of progress. The negative, it's a bipolar myth, as all archetypal myths are. It has its evil qualities and its really good qualities. It has its, the myth of progress at its worst is the myth that I need to live up to some expectation, that I ought to live a certain way, and that way is based on my introjected ego ideal, on what signifiers I've introjected as important. For instance, if I want to learn what it is to be a man, and I've introjected all these signifiers of masculinity, and then I consider myself making progress towards being a man, or whatever. That kind of progress is the normative, that's the wrong kind of progress. That's progress at its worst. But then there's the other kind of progress, which I guess we could speak of maybe in the way Jacques Lacan talks of progress, where he says, I completely deny any sort of idea of progress in the sense of a happy ending in psychoanalysis. But then he also says there is something one can speak of as progress, which is when the progressive revelation of subjective knowledge, what he calls savoir, is continuing, when it's not impeded. So there is something like an impediment to progress in the sense of, when there's psychic stagnation, when the libido stops flowing, or when one is unable, when one reaches a desert or an impasse of sorts, then there's no more progress. So I think we just have to realize that the myth of progress is very, like all archetypal myths, it's very bipolar, and there's really good ways of understanding it and bad ways of understanding it. So when someone says, I'm in favor of progress, we shouldn't agree or disagree. We should ask, what do you mean by progress? And even if someone says, is this true progress? Have we truly made progress? Well, that's not as useful of a question as what do you mean when you say progress? As Slavoj Zizek put it, the Slovenian philosopher, we shouldn't, as philosophers, ask whether this or that signifier is the true signifier, but rather what do we mean by this or that signifier? What does it signify? So in other words, if I'm asking, is this true freedom? That's not really a philosophical question. What I should instead ask is, what do you mean by freedom? Because for a capitalist, freedom might mean freedom, the free market, freedom to sell without restrictions. But for a communist, it might be freedom from exploitation from the bourgeois or something like that. So, we need to ask, what do people mean when they say things? What do you mean by progress? In what way is it progress? Because otherwise we end up, falling into all these traps, which really are the traps of ego inflation and archetypal identification, which is when we identify with something and it inflates us. And there's always this double-edged sword. I mean, really it's the fact that the mythic idea, like for example, the myth of utopia, it's the same thing. Utopia is this double-edged sword, this bipolar myth, because on the one hand, we need the myth of utopia. We need to hold on to this in its absolute sort of, dimension as this kind of, a society that's based on egalitarian principles, or a society that is based on equality, or, it's really good to have this kind of utopian idea. But the problem is we get fascism and totalitarianism oftentimes as the double-edged sword of utopia, which is that the story of utopia is often understood as a story of, we would have this if only there weren't such and such antagonistic element preventing our utopia. So we have to get rid of this antagonistic element, and once we eliminate it and get rid of all the last traces of this antagonism, then we can achieve our utopia. And that, of course, leads to fascist dictatorships, to totalitarianism. So it's the same with the myth of progress, in that the myth of progress really does have these two sides to it. It has the side of, we can call it the positive side, and which is maybe the scientific revolution or the Enlightenment, or even, so many projects of human, emancipation, and of overcoming ignorance, overcoming superstition, all these things. But there's also the negative side of it, which is that the negative side of this myth of progress is the perpetuation of normativity couched in so-called objectivity. It presents itself as neutral, but it's not really neutral. It actually privileges certain perspectives. And there's a lot of other problems with the myth of progress as well. So one of the best thinkers on this myth, and in fact the guy who I stole the term from, the term myth of progress, is a Jungian named Richard Tarnas, who actually has developed his own theory called archetypal cosmology. And so Tarnas actually says there are two major myths of our time. He talks about it in his 2006 book, Cosmos and Psyche, as well as in an essay which is available online if you search for Is the Modern Psyche Undergoing a Rite of Passage? By Richard Tarnas, PhD. And in these texts, he talks about the myth of progress and the myth of the fall from grace. And he says basically, these are the two all-encompassing pervasive myths, which basically any theoretical position can be reduced to identifying with more or less. And some people, acknowledge the myth, distance themselves from it. Others fully identify with it and have a sort of ego inflation. They, for instance, see themselves as crusaders bringing the voice of progress, the voice of reason to the masses. Or in the case of the myth of the fall from grace, they see themselves as crusaders. It's kind of what Timothy Morton calls beautiful soul syndrome. They see themselves as saviors who aren't too good or too bad, but just doing their best, and it's their job to do the best they can to protect innocent people from evil people and so on. So The myth of progress is the idea, it's this Promethean myth that humans are ultimately the arbiters of meaning, purpose, intelligence, all of these things in the whole cosmos, and that as such, humans are almost on this kind of mission as this sort of, it's almost like the Gnostic panspermia idea where, except instead of life spreading, it's reason and rationality, and it's our job as reasonable human beings to make progress over irrationality, over superstition, unreasonableness, and all that. And so it's really the myth one finds in the Enlightenment philosophy, a lot of things like that. But you also find it, strangely enough, in postmodernism and in certain areas that critique the cogito and all of that. So it's weird because you'll find the myth of progress you'll find it on the side of humanism and on the side of so-called post-humanists who wish to go beyond any human, because the humanists, they all say, we need to hold on dearly to this progress we've made as humans, to civilization and all these things, the things that make us human. The post-humanists then say we have to go beyond merely the human, we have to speculate about what's beyond human experience, outside of human, what is life like for a bat, or what is life like for these different organisms and so on. And the thing is, though, both of them rely on the myth of progress because they both think, oh, we're making progress over the previous, this is the next step, this is the progress over the previous. And what they both have in common, as Richard Tarnas points out, is they both consider humans as the sole arbiters of meaning in the world. The so-called post-humanists, I say so-called because I think they're the most anthropocentric of all. The so-called post-humanists are so against anthropocentrism, they say, don't project human attributes on the world. Any cosmological view that has to do with meaning is a humanist one, and we need to go beyond that because, we shouldn't project human meaning onto the cosmos. But as Tarnas points out, what's more anthropocentric, projecting so-called human meaning onto the world, or thinking that meaning is human in the first place? In other words, the reason that the post-humanists still haven't escaped the myth of progress is because they still imagine the human as this sort of privileged, as the one who has made progress over the rest, the privileged one who understands reason, who understands purpose. So any discussion of teleology in the cosmos itself, such as the discussion brought up by Thomas Nagel in his recent book, Mind and Cosmos from 2012, any of these ideas, the post-humanists say, oh, well, you're being anthropocentric because you're projecting meaning into the cosmos. But everyone knows the cosmos is meaningless, and we just, we humans create meaning as a coping mechanism. But what I'm saying is that that's the most anthropocentric of all. That's Richard Tarnas' point when he says basically those who critique anthropocentrism are often themselves guilty of a more pervasive, hidden form of anthropocentrism, which is that they implicitly think that meaning is human in the first place, or that purpose is human in the first place. So again, it's really difficult here because when we're talking about the myth of progress, oftentimes people in the postmodern, post-structuralist, all sorts of different areas will say, oh, well, we've eschewed the myth of progress, but what is that if not saying that you've progressed beyond the myth of progress? We've jettisoned the myth of progress. Well, yeah, you've made progress to the next stage beyond the myth of progress or whatever, it's impossible. It's like a meta-language. There is no meta-language. There is no progress of progress, So that's the problem, is that it's almost, as Osho put it, if you're trying to drop the ego and then you think to yourself, I'm dropping the ego, that's an even more subtle form of ego. Or if you're a prideful person, then you learn to be humble, you'll typically start having pride in your own humility. So it's the same kind of thing where the myth of progress kind of reifies everything. There's this kind of like reification, construction process where it's almost how what's abnormal for the old system becomes the new norm. So what's considered not progress for the old system is something different from progress, then becomes the standard of progress for the new system. So we have to be careful because there's always these molarizations, concretizations, crystallizations that basically because that's the problem is when we use these sort of concrete measurements of progress. So then if I were to say, okay, I'm not going to use any concrete measurements of progress, I'm going to use something else entirely, but then that has a way of becoming the new concrete measurement of progress. So it's almost impossible to escape the myth of progress. It's like a structural myth, because anything we attempt to do, it's almost the correlationist circle. Any gesture which escapes it is kind of subsumed by it, or reified by it. So anytime I'm trying to get out of progress, I end up progressing out of progress. And of course, there are ways to break this. The anti-correlationists have found a few strategies of breaking the correlation circle. Maybe we can apply one here, which is to say, I'm not going to even use the metaphor of the myth of progress when I talk about, because the myth of progress is a quantitative metaphor, I'm going to use the metaphor of difference in kind and say that what I'm doing is not progress, it's different qualitatively from progress. And these are the different qualities. And that's kind of a way of breaking the correlationist circle, because the correlationist circle does rely almost on this quantitative perspective, as if progress were a substance, as if it were an amount, that there's an amount of progress or an amount of sophistication or an amount of evolution or whatever you want to call it. But it's still really difficult because, so often I encounter intellectuals who think of their implicit duty. They've identified with this bastion of progress, this bastion of light in the sea of darkness. And so they self-identify with it kind of subtly, implicitly. They won't really avow it, but at this disavowed level, they kind of see themselves as fighting superstition, combating the last vestiges of archaic magical thinking in the world. Some people see themselves as philosophers who are trying to reconcile philosophy with natural science because they want to oust the last bit of metaphysical thinking in philosophy, or the last bit of, unscientific thinking. Or someone like a Jacques Derrida, who kind of identified himself as an anti-metaphysicist who is attempting to overcome presence. For him, his critique is always of the presence in so many things, and privilege, dual relations, and so on. So all these people end up perpetuating these myths of progress. And I don't mean to say it's entirely bad either, because we almost need the myth of progress. The frustration is that we can't do away with it. It's almost too easy if we could do away with it. If we could just do something else besides progress, it would be too easy, So it's the same thing when we talk about the sovereign, the master, the family, all these kind of things. The family unit organized around the father, or the church organized around the pope, or the corporation organized around the president. As Levi Bryant pointed out, these are all structurally the same despite their phenomenological difference. And for Levi Bryant, this is problematic. He wants to go beyond the sovereign. What does a post-sovereign society look like? What does a post-master society look like? But I don't think that's possible. I think we almost have to accept it. I'm with Badiou and Zizek, who both agreed. They basically defend the cult of personality around certain revolutionaries or certain great thinkers. And what they say is that the cult of personality around a certain master, even around Lacan or around Zizek, or basically anyone, can become this sort of what Jung called the mana personality. Anyone can come to take on a sort of a magical aura, like a king or whatever. But the thing is, the critique of these people is always that they're not universal. But what Zizek was saying in Less Than Nothing, drawing from Badiou, is that universality is embodied in certain singular particularities. For instance, when somebody becomes synonymous with a movement like Robespierre and the French Revolution, there could be a cult of personality around Robespierre, but that's almost necessary because it's elevating the singular of somebody who declared somebody who represented the absolute of this kind of universal, it's basically, if I were to worship somebody who had completely selfish personal interest, that's pretty much indefensible. But the worship or the privilege of this, of course we have to be careful, we don't want to privilege the other too much, but I'm saying that there's a certain amount of it which is understandable, because when I'm actually, say I really like Bucky Fuller, say I privilege Bucky Fuller, well, it's not that I think he has all the answers. I read my Jacques Lacan, I know that I should realize the lack in the other. I should realize that, he's just as inconsistent and just as flawed. I shouldn't have some, project the subject supposed to know on him, or the myth of mastery. But at the same time, Bucky Fuller represents this universality in his own particular singularity, in that he represents the desire to universally clothe and feed all humans, and this desire to help all of the world. The way he writes speaks to a certain universality where I understand the need for any revolutionary kind of project to have a sort of and there's also just the convenience, it's like Deleuze and Guattari said at the beginning of A Thousand Plateaus. They chose to keep their own names out of just because it's nice to be able to talk like everyone else and to say that the sun rises and the sun sets, even though we know that's not the case. So there's no up and down. There's only closer and further away in three-dimensional space. So I think it is really important, to be able to stick with these frustrating things, the master, the sovereign, and it's very frustrating. The myth of progress is a very frustrating myth because it would be, so easy. It's too easy if we could just get away from that. If all we had to do was overcome the myth of progress, we would have done it by now. If all we had to do was overcome mastery or go to a post-sovereign society, then we probably would have done that already, which I know isn't the best argument because, of course, life is incomplete. But, I guess my point here is just that in all of these critiques of progress, I'm not saying we should go beyond it as much as we have to struggle with it. We have to sit with it. We have to contend with it. It's almost this deadlock or this inescapable context where the more we try to escape it, the more we perpetuate it. So it's the same thing with the myth of mastery or, the privileged other and so on, is that then the one who doesn't believe the myth of mastery becomes the new master. So Levi Bryant's project of a post-sovereign society, well, then that will just be the new sovereignty. So there's this sort of reification process. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we should instead have a more balanced, less black and white approach to it, where we say, okay, the myth of progress is this sort of all-encompassing mythopoetic truth. And as a mythopoetic truth, we can realize that it has these bipolar elements to it. It's good, it's bad, it's numerous things that are all kind of contradictory, yet it's all these things at once. And that's much more complex and difficult, and we have to struggle with it instead of just saying, oh, let's get rid of it. If it were just as easy as don't believe in the, progress is BS and just get rid of it, then that would be too easy. It's that the reason I'm even talking about progress is because it's something everyone struggles with. Everyone feels that despair of, am I really making progress, or am I spinning my wheels, or, and perhaps as philosophers, we shouldn't ask, am I making real progress? Because again, we should just ask, what do I mean by this progress? What do I really mean by it? How can I better elucidate my understanding of progress? So, okay, the other myth is equally pernicious and equally good and bad and all these other things, equally complex. That's the myth of the fall from grace. And it's basically, I touched on it a little bit talking about utopia. It's kind of identical to the myth of utopia. The myth of the fall from grace is often a support of the myth of progress, but it can also be an antagonistic, it's weird. As Tarnas puts it, it's like one of those optical it's like an optical illusion where you can see the old woman or the young woman, at the same time, or you can see two faces, but depending on how you shift your perspective, you see one or the other. And he said that's what it's like with these two myths, that both myths are kind of always already present and informing everything or apparent in everything, but that it depends on which one you look at, you can see one or the other. So the same exact thing can be seen as the myth of progress, the rise of man, typically the masculine myth, or the fall from grace, the loss of innocence, the kind of typically maternal myth, what Howard Schwartz calls the libidinal economy of the maternal image, or the maternal imago, which is Latin for image. But, basically, there are the two myths where, say I make a lot of progress, you could see all of my so-called progress as also being a fall from grace or a loss of innocence. So the myth of progress cherishes knowledge more than anything else, gnosis, basically, enlightenment. And as such, as U.G. Krishnamurti put it, the one seeking enlightenment is no different than a drug user looking for a fix. So whether you're a spiritual ascendant in an ashram or whether you're a heroin addict looking for the next fix, it's no different. You're looking for pleasure without pain. You're looking to get rid of your frustration, So I think these are all kind of double-edged swords. It's, the myth of progress is the typically masculine myth, which on the one hand has given rise to most of civilization as we know it, but on the other hand has led to this, what is attacked by people like Ria and Eisler as a competitor culture or a dominator culture, the patriarchy, this sort of hegemonic power structure. I mean, really it's the libidinal economy of power or respect on the side of the paternal function, which is the myth of progress. Then it's the competing libidinal economy of love or mercy on the side of the maternal economy, which demands. So it's really a clash of libidinal economies, by which I mean there's two completely different, but they're both always active, and you can see that's what's so confusing about almost is that it's hard to tell. Which myth am I perpetuating, or which myth am I identifying with even sometimes, because the same behavior can be explained through both myths equally. So you almost have to buy into one myth or the other, and then you'll see the world that way. But which one you buy into already means you're going to elicit that kind of a way of seeing the world. They're almost like two different perspectives. And so Howard Schwartz has done a lot of work on this, where he talks about institutional narcissism, organizational narcissism, and what he talks about is this idea that a lot of organizations will get overtaken by, he doesn't use this term, but by the myth of the fall from grace. They get overtaken by this maternal imago, or this, like he said, a lot of liberal arts colleges do, where if you've had any privilege at all, you're seen as a tool of oppression, and your achievements are seen as stemming from your privilege. You don't really deserve your achievements because you had the privilege, you had access to the things that allowed you to have those achievements. So because you already had that privileged access, basically it's this whole idea that the marginalized and the oppressed are most worthy of our love. And if you are an overachiever or somebody who basically perpetuates the myth of progress, then you're part of the problem. So it's almost the demonization of the myth of progress, the vilification of those people who would perpetuate it, entrepreneurial spirits, or people who have any sort of privilege at all, really. And it's always this relative thing where if you're teaching a class and you buy into this sort of maternal imago economy, then say you have one student who's a refugee from a war-torn country, and you have another student who's like really wealthy and has a family business and makes millions of dollars. You will typically see the student who's really wealthy as a tool of oppression and privilege, and you'll see this refugee, marginalized, oppressed person as your sort of underdog who you have to root for to fight the good fight, to make sure, because that person's more deserving of your love than this other person. So it's a whole economy based on love, and it's the idea of who's most deserving of love. And respect or power doesn't really come into it, except insofar as power is seen as, the exertion of power is seen as oppression. Power oppresses from this perspective. So then from the other perspective, the more paternal function, libidinal economy of the myth of progress, it's actually the opposite. It's that those who perpetuate the myth of the fall are demonized, and instead the myth of progress people are sort of elevated or dignified as, oh, we're so sophisticated, we've made so much progress. So as Zizek pointed out, a lot of ecologists are what he calls eco-conservatives. A lot of people who really care about the environment, they would be what Tarnas identifies as believers in the myth of the fall from grace. But here's the double-edged sword, is that their proposed solutions are always have to do with the myth of progress. So it really shows how these two myths, that's why it's so confusing, the two myths are almost always present. So just to give an example, say that I'm complaining about the destruction of nature from technology. Well, what this is a core antagonism between society and nature, or between technology and nature, between human and animal, whatever you want to call it. There's a split, there's an antagonism. And what I'm imagining is this fall from grace, which is this purely imaginary kind of sentimentality for a supposed utopia that we used to have that we don't have anymore. It's the idea that we used to have some sort of a non-antagonistic relationship. We humans had a non-antagonistic relationship with nature, where we were capable of engaging with nature in a way being one with the earth. Maybe we look at various Aboriginal or First Nation, various native groups and so on, and we say, we need to learn from them. We need to learn from the past how to be back in harmony with nature. But of course this is a myth, because there never was a harmony of nature, because there is no nature of nature, as Badiou puts it. There's no ordinal of ordinals. There's no set of all sets. So basically, there's no nature of nature means that nature never has an equilibrium. Nature is always marked by radical antagonism. Nature doesn't have a way of being, because that would be like a quality of quality, or a truth of truth. It just doesn't exist. Or a language of language. Some neutral, objective way outside of, a position outside of positionality from where we could look at all the positions and correctly identify them. It doesn't exist. The only positions are the ones that there are, and each one is subjectively engaged and so on. So basically, in the eco-conservative myth, it fails to grasp that there never was an equilibrium, and it projects this sort of equilibrium as an image, basically in this kind of founding myth, like Riane Eisler does it in Chalice and the Blade, when she talks about competitor culture rising about, I think, 2000 BC. Before that, there was cooperator culture, which was a maternal culture. Then the nasty patriarchy came along. I'm oversimplifying, but the gist of it is thousands of years of peaceful human nature cooperation, and it's totally reciprocal. It's the myth of reciprocity that Lacan and Derrida and others have so thoroughly critiqued. The myth of a symmetrical dual relation, of this reciprocal thing where humans help the earth and the earth helps the humans, and we live in harmony and there's no antagonism. It's just this really nice, neat dual relation. But then what happens is the patriarchy comes along and they introduce war, they introduce antagonism, discord. So really, I just explained the myth of utopia, which is the founding myth of so many fascist ideologies as well. It's the myth that we need to return to the good old-fashioned family values of the 1950s, or, everything was fine until the bankers came along, or some other group that are leeching. The parasite group came along and started leeching off and causing all the problems. So for Riane Eisler, that's men. The men came along, the patriarchy, they started to compete and have this competitor-dominator culture that all fought, and they introduced war, they introduced violence, they introduced domination and competition. But, for Hitler it was the Jew, or for Occupy Wall Street it's the banker, which is basically the modern figure of the Jew. Basically, whatever ideology you have, if it's one of these if it has a utopian foundational myth, if it follows the myth of the myth of the fall from grace, it's going to inevitably be at risk of turning into a fascist totalitarianism. But the interesting thing is how this also supports the myth of progress. So back to the eco-conservatism, and Zizek pointed this out. He said, so that the story goes, technology is destroying the environment because it's extracting all these things we need from the environment, usable things. We extract silver, we extract all these different precious metals from the ground, we extract all these materials and convert these materials. So technology is destroying the environment, but the only solution anyone can come up with, this is the myth of progress here, is more efficient exploitation of the environment. The real problem the eco-conservatives have isn't that we're exploiting the environment, it's that it's inefficient. It's just not efficient because it creates a lot of waste, and then we need to spend a lot of time, energy, and money to fix all the waste. So really, the hidden secret demand of the eco-conservative is actually more progress. They're actually demanding more technological progress. So it's like they can be a Luddite and say, I'm totally against technology, I hate technology, we need to go back to the land and do away with technology. But implicitly, secretly, even to them, the only solution that they really are hinting at is to have even better technology that doesn't produce waste. We need to have this progress. We need to make progress to some sort of a non-waste producing technology so that we can create this equilibrium. So that shows how there is this sort of hand-in-hand myth of progress and the myth of the fall from grace working together, because it's the myth of the fall from grace that postulates this utopia, and the myth of progress that says we can get to the utopia if only we do this and this and this. So the fall from grace is the part of the myth that says we had this thing and we lost it. The myth of progress is the thing that says, and this is how we get it back. So basically they both do have that same kind of relationship. The other thing I'd like to mention is the relation of, there was a really good point from Levi Bryant about pre-analysis and post-analysis. One difference in how people subjectively experience life, which is that pre-analysis, before, I think he's talking in particular about Lacanian psychoanalysis, people oftentimes have an experience of loss, but after analysis they have an experience of lack. And the idea of loss is that we had something and we lost it. The idea of lack is that we never had it to begin with, and we, in fact, could never have it because it's structurally lacking. It's structurally gone. So the difference in loss and lack is a pretty crucial difference here, because the idea is that before I go to analysis, I have this idea of loss. Maybe, that I used to have this equilibrium, or I used to have this loving connection that I lost, or that I used to have whatever. I used to be in love and I lost that love and feeling. I used to be really inspired and I lost my creativity. I used to be whatever. It's this idea of the past, which is this myth of the past, this sentimentality, which always imagines it better than it actually was. And it always imagines kind of a privileged past where the lack is repressed. I repress the lack in my image of the past. And so there's always this idea of loss, and then that's what we have to give up. We have to accept lack, which is coming to realize the lack in the other, coming to realize, as Zizek puts it, it's the difference of being jealous of somebody else because they have what you don't have. That's loss, because it's like they have all this really good stuff. That's repressing their lack. Then you compare that, as Zizek puts it, to realizing things are equally miserable everywhere. The real solidarity we feel is the shared lack. It's not any shared positive attributes or positive traits we have. I don't feel solidarity or camaraderie with people based on what positive attributes that we actually have. I feel that solidarity based on our mutual shared lack. It's the fact that we all lack the right answer, so we can commiserate over our shared lack. It's almost like in relationships, when you're having a lot of relationship trouble, the most comforting thing is to talk to somebody else who's had relationship trouble. And it's not that you've had even the same problems or that you and that person share any positive attributes. It's that both of you are at a loss for words, or both of you have experienced the same lack. The lack of knowing what to do, the lack of a solution to, So basically, lack is... So in this sense now, there is something like progress. There's progress from thinking of things as lost to realizing that they're actually lack. And the same can be said with progress from helplessness to fear. Because if I imagine I'm helpless, there's nothing I can do about it. But if I imagine I'm afraid, there is something I can do. So a big part of, even for therapists, they oftentimes have to remind themselves there's a difference in helplessness and fear. A hysteric will oftentimes present himself or herself as helpless, when really that person is just afraid. And so there is this sort of a progress we can speak of when we talk about progressing from one understanding of something to another, or maybe in the sense of Deleuze in Bergsonism, a book he wrote in 1966, he talks about false composites, which they're mistaken ways of thinking about things. So there's progress that happens when we overcome or overturn that false composite. Maybe even like Jacques Derrida's idea of overturning false dual relations. Well, when we overturn something, there is something like progress. But I think that progress, the problem is always that it gets reified, or it gets reified back into this. It's almost, the moment of progress is a moment of confusion, this aporia, but then we typically want to evacuate our confusion. We don't think of confusion as a productive state of mind, so we want to get rid of that confusion, and that's losing what little progress we've made. It's almost, the progress you can make is knowing how little you know, or the progress you can make is coming to a state of confusion. But then once you get to that state, then you go, oh, I get it, it's this, and then you lose the confusion, you go back to misrecognition, which is the normal state of things, where the ego is constantly recognizing or misrecognizing, perpetuating the discourse of the university, which is the discourse which says, every time I see something, I'm going to fit it into my preconceived notion. So every time I'm seeing something new, it's not actually new at the level of structure, it's only new at the phenomenological level. And I might consider that to be progress of myself, because but see, that's not really progress, because I'm not remaining open to alterity at the level of structure. I'm actually completely closed to the idea of any new or different structures. I'm only open, I elicit responses from things which fit into my preconceived notions, so I can simply find every encounter is not a real encounter, it's not an honest truth event, it's an encounter with something which I interpret as new phenomenological contents which express the same structure. And that is not really progress, because I'm actually just finding the same thing again and again and again. Like how even Freud admitted to Jung how Freud was bored with his dream interpretations, because he was doing that. He was basically interpreting each dream through a sort of a standard framework, understanding the Oedipal complex and so on. And that's also bad Jungians, which, Jung would never do this, von Franz would never do this, but bad Jungians would say, oh, you had a dream, well, this character's the shadow, that character's the anima, this and this is how it works. It's almost paint by numbers. Let's just take whatever new contents we have, whatever new dreams we have, let's fit them into our existing structure, and we'll never even change the structure or have any sort of adaptation of it. The structure will never make progress, only... So basically, the myth of progress is one of those things where we have to ask what we mean. We have to ask, do we mean progress at the level of content or the level of structure? And progress at the level of structure doesn't even really... we should use a different term than progress. We should just say difference in kind even, because there are qualitative shifts or differences in kind that happen, and that it's almost, when we think of progress, we use a quantitative metaphor, and the quantitative metaphor fails to grasp differences in kind. If I only look at the temperature of water based on quantity, then I'll notice, based on the quantitative metaphor, I talk about the temperature and I say, well, at 0 degrees Celsius to 100 degrees Celsius, that's the range it's liquid. But, I don't take into account, unless I understand the concept of difference in kind, when liquid becomes solid at the level of 0, or when liquid becomes gaseous at 100. Those are differences in kind, and those are singularity points where no quantitative analysis will really fully grasp it. So I think it's the same thing where, if we're not careful, when we imagine progress as a substance or as a quantity of progress that you can have. And we imagine regression as this opposite pole, and we think in this kind of polarized, I'm either making progress or I'm not making progress. I'm either getting better or I'm getting worse. And it's that sort of binary logic or dual relation that's so problematic. So if there is progress, it's almost meta progress at the level of... But see, this is the difficulty, because there is no meta progress in the sense there's no meta language. So what it really is it's a redefinition of progress qualitatively instead of quantitatively, to say that there is no yardstick of progress, or there's no... Progress is unpredictable. It's unpredictable, it's irreproducible, there's no neutral way to measure it. So there is something like true progress, but this true progress is only ascertainable from an engaged subjective position, kind of like how Zizek talks about truth. He'll say that there is a truth of a situation, but you have to be subjectively engaged. You can't just say that's an inevitable truth, So it's almost the idea here that we need to fight for the right kind of progress. Like when Deleuze was asked what he thought philosophers did, he said, fight the tide of stupidity. So what is that if not a kind of myth of progress? Stupidity is seen as regression. Progress is fighting against that stupidity. So in some sense, we almost need a bare minimum of this myth of progress. It's just everyone defines it differently. So the real question is not how do we go beyond the myth of progress, but how do we define the myth of progress personally? What does progress mean to us? And then once we have that, what it actually means to us, we can ask, is this productive or unproductive, depending on what we want to do? Are we perpetuating the very thing we decry? How does it function? What does it do? The idea then is, what does our progress do? And it's less about what is our progress even, what is progress to me, as opposed to how does it function? How does the idea of progress function to me? So maybe progress will be really useful and helpful if it functions in a way that allows me to create a lot of new concepts in my philosophy, or if it allows me to really mine a lot of rich territory for ideas and so on. But it could also be completely unproductive if it only traps me in this sort of endless correlationist circle where everything I experience is reified, or in the a university of the discourse where everything I experience is fit into these certain structures. So it's a difficult question, and I think we can't do away with it. We almost have to bear. It's almost, the challenge is to hold the opposites. The challenge is to hold it's like there's two sets of opposites. In the myth of progress, there's the bipolarity of the myth of progress, but there's almost a quaternio between the myth of progress on one side and the myth of the fall from grace on the other. And we have to hold the opposites between the myth of progress and the myth of the fall, but also the internal opposites in each of those. So, but again, the myth of opposition is quantitative, and I almost think we need an understanding of difference in kind or qualitative shifts to fully do it justice. So I guess my last cautionary note is just when we're thinking about progress, we should always ask, am I really making progress? Or not even am I really making it, is it real progress? Because that wouldn't be helpful. But is my conception of progress doing justice? Is it productive? And what is it doing? What is it doing? What does my idea of progress do? Does my idea of progress produce the same essay endlessly rephrased? Which is what happens when people get caught up in this idea, this subconscious self-identification as a bastion of free thought, fighting against superstition, fighting against, ignorance. Or is my notion of progress this idea that's more productive in the sense of always challenging me to do something new or something different, something that I haven't done before? I guess progress is really difficult, and it's even, if we're talking at a personal level, not just philosophically or in terms of theoretical constructs, but at a personal level, it's even harder in some ways, because at least theoretically you can kind of feel vindicated when you feel like your theories have progressed enough to take on a new unexpected form that you didn't expect, that you didn't anticipate, stuff like that. But then at a personal level, that's kind of even more difficult, because there can be this feeling of it's hard to explain, but I guess at a personal level, there's always the danger that whatever is experienced as an epiphany or I realized that it's this, I finally had a breakthrough, that then becomes the new shelter, the new weapon, the new ceiling, the new conditions of possibility, the new limitation. So there really is this sort of, we're never done. I guess I'm fine with using the word progress as long as we understand, we use it in the same way as Hegel's synthesis, understood in the Kojevian sense of never being able to attain that synthesis, the unattainable synthesis. If we think of progress as this unattainable, progressing towards something which we can never attain, in the same way that the norm is unattainable. There is no such thing as, there's no one standard norm. Norms are these kind of quasi-objects generated by the computation of all of the different, so if we think of progress in that way as something which we can never really attain, but is nevertheless a structural principle. And also, I guess, if we think of progress as Tarnas does, as relating to the Promethean impulse, in that sense I really can get along with it well, because I see in the Promethean impulse of rebellion, this great sentiment of egalitarianism, emancipation of the human spirit. So really, it's, if we look at progress from that perspective, it's just we have to keep a proper distance from the archetype. That's always the thing. When we over-identify with an archetype, we lose our individuality. We de-individuate and become like a puppet. We become archetypally possessed, so to speak, by this or that complex. And I think everyone's met somebody who comes across like a puppet because he or she believes his or her beliefs too directly. There's no mediation between who the person is and that person's belief. So that person becomes a sort of a puppet, or becomes an expression of that archetype too directly. It's up to each of us to sort of temper our character with the archetypes, but to not give up our personal character and fully identify with the archetypes, lest we become completely lacking in individual features. And so even then, maybe there's a sense that progress is individuation, and that progress comes when one is able to inflect and be inflected by, or when one has the capacity to affect and be affected by various archetypal complexes without having a sort of a binary response to them, without having a fight or flight response, or without love-hate without identification or disidentification. If I can hold that frustration and hold these archetypal complexes and sort of live with them, then we could say I've made something like progress. But unfortunately, all too often, the myth of progress is an excuse. It gives us the excuse to evacuate that frustration. So we can say, oh, I've made progress, but our desire for saying that is already the desire to be free from all the antagonism or the conflict. It's almost at the moment we say, I've made progress, it's when we haven't, when we stop. It's like those who say don't know and those who know don't say. So there is this sort of a difficult catch-22 about progress, which is as soon as you think you've done it is when you've stopped. But there is something like progress, in the progressive revelation of one's subjective history, and also in these shifts of understanding, how we have conceptual shifts or perspectival shifts even. So it's just that we shouldn't rush to see the reality behind the illusion, because the illusion itself is what frustrates us, and the desire to see the reality behind it is the evacuation of that frustration. And so when we say, I'm going to make progress, I want to see things the way they really are behind the illusion, what we should realize is that's the wrong kind of progress. That's this quantitative normative progress, where there's a different kind of progress, which is coming to terms with the illusions and accepting them and being able to live with that ambiguity, living with ambivalence, living with conflicting desires and conflicting messages, and all the anxiety that's caused by conflicting good and bad news and all of that. So I guess there is no meta progress, but there is something like a different kind of progress, which is that oftentimes we're faced with a problem and we think that the solution is the path of progress, but really the path of progress is making that problem no longer relevant. As Carl Jung put it, we don't solve our problems, we outgrow them. So, or as Deleuze says, we should apply the test of true and false not only to solutions, but also to problems themselves. Not only to answers, but also to questions. So, all too often we pose the question in such a way that the solution seems to be progress. If only I could get the solution, I would have made progress. Like, the solution to a scientific question or problem, to answer to a scientific question is seen as progress. But at an interpersonal level, that's not always the case. In fact, it can be said that somebody individuates or matures, and again, this is not normative at all, because it's different for everyone, but we could say when he or she comes to his or her own conclusions about that thing and stops believing the mass collective normative idea. And so in a way, it's almost, there's two competing forms of progress. There's progress towards conformity, which is de-individuation. Then there's progress towards difference, which is individuation, non-conformity. And both of those can be framed as progress or presented as progress. If you take somebody who doesn't fit into society at all, and then they learn how to conform, you can say, oh, that person's made a lot of progress. But that's what? Progress towards conforming with societal expectations. Similarly, if you take a conformist and then you say, finally that person broke out of their shell and, she or he has now been able to express her or his true calling and found her or his vocation, that is a different kind of progress. So I guess there's the progress of vocation, of hearing one's true voice, which is a totally non-normative progress, the progress of individuation, which is irreproducible, But all too often, the myth of progress ends up falling short of this and ends up being concretized in some sort of standardized, oh, your grades are getting better, you're making progress at school. Oh, you've memorized all this stuff, you're making progress, this idea of progress, or in therapy. Oh, you've come to realize what your symptom is, you've come to realize your label, now you've made progress. Well, this is what's so difficult. For Lacan, he says that already for the hysteric, the label, the symptom, has more power than the name. So already when the hysteric, it's almost learning one symptom, again, just creates a new shelter, a new weapon, a new shield. It doesn't necessarily, we have to eternally be vigilant. The most difficult thing is this eternal frustration or kind of ineluctable antagonism, which is that as soon as we feel like we've finally quashed the antagonism, we can be sure at that point that we have regressed to some sort of a pre-antagonistic myth of utopia or whatever the case may be. And so it seems like to achieve progress, what we need to do is get rid of all the antagonism, but really we need to learn to bear the antagonism. That is maybe the two definitions of progress put succinctly, which is that the naive perspective of progress says, I've made progress when I've gotten rid of all the antagonism. But the more mature, and again, I don't mean mature in a normative sense, but the better version of progress is the version of progress which says, I can now bear this antagonism. I can accept this ambivalence. It's not that I've totally eradicated all antagonism or eliminated all ambivalence. It's that I've come to accept that ambivalence or that antagonism. So, or even if we're going to say I've come to accept that lack, if we're going to talk about the loss and lack distinction again, it's not that I finally get the thing that I imagine I've lost, it's that I give up on the idea that I lost it to begin with and I accept the lack of the situation. So that is a kind of a qualitative shift, which could also be seen as progress, where I've given up my attachment to a perceived lost object and I've acquiesced and kind of accepted this lack. And it gives me a different perspective because then I'm not jealous of other people as much. I don't think that they have the thing I lost and so on. So, all right, well, these are kind of my random thoughts about progress. This wasn't prepared at all. This was just completely off the top of my head. So sorry if I rambled or, went a little bit off track. But I do think that this is a really interesting area that deserves more research. And I'll just say that for people who are interested in this, I recommend reading Ernst Bloch. Ernst Bloch wrote a lot about utopia. I also recommend Slavoj Zizek's Reality of the Virtual. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Richard Tarnas' Cosmos and Psyche talks a lot about the myth of progress and how it fits into our current milieu. Thanks for listening.